On Thanksgiving morning in the year 1900, an 18-year-old young man named Thomas Pedler woke up early in his family's small, drafty apartment. He lived in a very quiet, working-class neighborhood in the city of San Francisco, California. At this time in history, San Francisco was a bustling port city filled with sailors, laborers, and immigrants who were all trying to carve out a living. But in Thomas's specific neighborhood, life was generally very slow and very predictable. It was the kind of place where people worked long, grueling hours in factories or on the docks, came home to their families, and did the exact same thing the next day. Nothing out of the ordinary ever really happened there. But on this particular Thanksgiving morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with an electric energy. That was because a massive, highly anticipated event was taking place right in Thomas's district. The legendary annual college football game between Stanford University and the University of California was scheduled to play at the local stadium. This was not just a simple game. It was a massive cultural spectacle, and the city was expecting over 20,000 people to pack into the stadium to watch it. Thomas was absolutely determined not to miss this event. The problem was, Thomas did not have any money to buy a ticket. Tickets were a luxury his family simply could not afford, especially during a time when every single penny was needed for basic necessities like rent and food. But Thomas was a resourceful young man, and he knew that if he could just get close to the stadium, he would find some way to catch a glimpse of the action. And so, as his mother was busy in the kitchen preparing their modest Thanksgiving dinner, Thomas grabbed his heavy woolen coat, slipped his arms into his jacket, and headed out the door. He promised his mother he would be back in time for the afternoon turkey, and then he ran down the cobblestone streets toward the stadium, which was only a short distance from his home. When Thomas arrived, the streets surrounding the stadium were already a chaotic sea of humanity. People were streaming in from every direction, dressed in their holiday finest. There were men in top hats, women in long, elegant dresses, and children darting through the crowd, all laughing and talking excitedly. Thomas made his way to the front gate where the crowd was at its thickest. It was around 11 in the morning when Thomas spotted his close friend Charles. Charles was also a young man from the neighborhood, and the two of them had planned to meet up to try and figure out a way into the game. At first, their plan was simple. They figured they could just blend in with the massive moving wall of people who had tickets and somehow sneak past the ticket takers at the front gates. But as they stood there watching the flow of the crowd, they realized that was going to be completely impossible. Even though the actual kickoff of the game was still several hours away, scheduled for 2:30 in the afternoon, the stadium was already completely packed. People who actually had tickets were struggling to find a place to sit, and many were standing on the stairways and along the railings just to get a view. Thomas and Charles looked at each other and realized that even if they did manage to slip inside, they would not be able to see anything anyway. They needed a new plan. And so, the two young men decided to walk around the perimeter of the stadium to see if they could find another vantage point. They noticed that a high wooden fence lined the entire outer edge of the stadium. Some people had already climbed up onto the fence, balancing precariously on the wooden boards to look down onto the field. Thomas and Charles decided to try this as well. But as they walked along the fence line, they quickly saw that all the good spots were already taken. The only open areas on the fence offered absolutely no view of the field because they were blocked by large promotional signs and structural supports. Thomas and Charles were starting to get frustrated. They began to worry that they were going to miss the entire game, which would be incredibly disappointing after all the anticipation. But then, as they walked back toward the front gates of the stadium, they noticed something happening across the street. A large group of people was rushing over toward a massive white brick building. This building was a 5-story factory that stood directly opposite the stadium wall. Thomas and Charles watched as these people began placing wooden ladders against the sides of the factory building. Others were climbing up the fire escapes, while some were literally free climbing using the window ledges and the decorative brickwork as handholds to make their way up. Thomas and Charles realized that the top of this factory was completely flat, and because of its height, it would provide an absolutely perfect, unobstructed view of the entire football field inside the stadium. Without any hesitation, the two young men decided they were going to join them. They ran across the street, found an open ladder, and began their climb. They went up, step by step, feeling the cold brick of the building against their hands until they finally made it onto the flat roof, 55 feet above the cobblestone street below. When they first got up there, the crowd was still relatively small, so Thomas and Charles were able to run right over to the front edge of the building and claim a prime spot with an incredible view of the field. For the next couple of hours, they waited excitedly as the stadium below filled to its absolute limit. But as the clock ticked closer to 2:30, more and more people kept climbing onto the roof. By the time the opening kickoff actually occurred, the flat rooftop of the factory was completely packed with hundreds of people. It was standing room only, and people were jostling and shoving each other to try and get a better view. Down below, on the street level, a few of the factory workers had come outside. They looked up, saw the massive crowd of people standing on their roof, and began shouting at them to get down. They warned them that the roof was not designed to support that kind of weight and that it was extremely dangerous. But nobody on the roof listened to them. The noise from the stadium was far too loud, and the excitement of the game was far too intense. The local police officers who were patrolling the area either did not notice what was happening on top of the building, or they simply chose to ignore it because they were too busy managing the crowds at the stadium gates. And so, the party on the roof continued. As soon as the game began, the crowd inside the stadium erupted into a deafening roar. The sounds of brass bands, cheering fans, and referee whistles carried easily across the street to the rooftop. The energy was infectious, and the people on the roof, including Thomas and Charles, began singing, chanting, and screaming along with the stadium crowd. It was total chaos, and the two friends were having the absolute time of their lives. But about 20 minutes into the game, as the excitement was reaching a fever pitch, a dull, sharp, cracking sound echoed from the far side of the roof. Thomas and Charles spun around to see where the noise had come from. As they looked out across the sea of people, they noticed that on the far edge of the roof, people were suddenly scrambling, shoving, and trying to run back toward the ladders and fire escapes. But before Thomas, Charles, or anyone else near them could figure out what was happening, a second, much louder, and more terrifying cracking sound ripped through the air, and then, in an instant, the entire roof beneath them collapsed. Hundreds of people who had been standing on the roof fell straight down into the dark, hollow interior of the factory, plunging 55 feet toward the ground. Now, you have to understand that this was not a typical factory with multiple floors inside. Instead, it was a massive open shell of a building. Right in the very center of this empty space stood a huge, 40-foot-tall brick structure that made up the core of the factory. This building was actually a glass factory, and in order to melt the raw materials and sand required to make glass, the factory used an industrial furnace. This brick structure in the center of the building was that furnace, and on this Thanksgiving Day, it was fully operational and burning at its maximum capacity. Inside the furnace, the temperature was over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is hotter than actual volcanic lava. While the hottest part of the furnace was insulated deep inside the brick structure, the exterior brick walls of the furnace were still incredibly hot. It was so hot that the factory workers could not even stand near the structure without wearing special protective gear, and they had to use extremely long metal pokers to manipulate the molten glass from a safe distance. As the roof collapsed, Thomas fell through the air. But miraculously, as he fell, he managed to grab hold of a thick wooden support beam that stretched across the upper part of the factory ceiling. He clung to the beam with all his strength, saving himself from falling all the way to the bottom. He had only fallen about 5 feet, and although he was physically uninjured, he was dangling 55 feet in the air, and his grip on the dusty, rough wood of the beam was slippery and unstable. Thomas looked down through the rising dust and smoke to see what had happened to the others. He could hear people screaming in agony, and he saw survivors on the ground running around frantically, trying to help those who had been injured by the fall. Thomas immediately began scanning the wreckage for his friend Charles. Within a few moments, he spotted him. At first, Thomas felt a wave of relief because Charles seemed to have been one of the lucky ones. Instead of falling 55 feet all the way to the concrete floor of the factory, Charles and about 15 or 20 other people had landed directly on the flat brick top of the massive glass furnace. They had only fallen about 10 or 15 feet, and they did not appear to have suffered any broken bones or catastrophic injuries from the impact of the fall. Thomas thought to himself that his friend was going to be okay. But then, the second Charles and the others hit the top of that brick furnace, their relief turned into absolute horror. Despite not having major injuries from the fall itself, the sheer radiant heat of the furnace exterior was catastrophic. Instantly, these people began letting out primal, blood-curdling screams of pure agony. As they shrieked, loud, rapid popping and snapping sounds began coming from their bodies as their clothes and skin instantly ignited on fire. The heat was so intense that their bodies began to violently contort and curl up, almost like dry leaves rolling up on themselves in a fire. Thomas, dangling from the beam above, had to watch in absolute horror as his close friend Charles and the others burned and smoldered on top of the furnace, screaming in unimaginable pain. Charles's body curled up so tightly from the intense heat that he began to roll down the curved side of the brick furnace. As he rolled, he slipped into a large crack in the brickwork and fell directly into the 4,000-degree flames inside. His screams stopped instantly. Around the time that the screams on the furnace began to fade, a crowd of people from the street heard the noise and rushed into the factory to help. Among the people who ran into the building was Thomas's own father. In a terrible twist of fate, Thomas's father looked up into the smoky rafters of the factory and saw his son, Thomas, clinging desperately to the wooden beam. But the air inside the factory was rapidly heating up from the open furnace, and the temperature near the ceiling was becoming unbearable. Thomas was sweating profusely, and his hands were losing their grip on the slippery wood. His father watched in absolute terror as Thomas's hands finally slipped. Thomas fell 10 feet down, landing feet first on the hot exterior of the brick furnace. He immediately collapsed onto his stomach and face. Just like the others, his clothes instantly caught fire and he began to shriek in pain before going completely silent. In total, 23 people were killed during the horrific roof collapse, and dozens more were left with terrible, life-altering burns and disfigurements. This event would go down in history as one of the single worst disasters to ever occur near a sporting event. Yet, on that Thanksgiving Day, the crowd inside the stadium was so completely caught up in the excitement of the football game that they did not even realize a major tragedy had just occurred only 100 feet away from them. It was not until the game ended and the winning team's fans carried their players out of the stadium in a massive, spontaneous celebratory parade that they walked out onto the street and saw the horrific, charred, and contorted bodies of the victims lined up on the cobblestones outside the glass factory. At the end of December in 1984, in a small, isolated village in northern India, a young woman named Sumitra gave birth to her very first child, a healthy baby boy. Right away, Sumitra fell deeply in love with her new son. She had wanted to be a mother for as long as she could remember, and now that her dream had finally come true, she was completely inseparable from her baby. She carried him with her everywhere she went, strapped securely to her chest in a soft cloth sling. Anytime she had a free hand from her daily chores, like cooking, washing, or cleaning, she would use it to gently pat his head, tickle his tiny feet, or whisper sweet things to him. Life was not easy for anyone living in Sumitra's village, which was located just south of the majestic Himalayan mountains, right along the banks of the sacred Ganges River. The village was extremely poor, and the residents lived in simple mud huts with thatched roofs. There was no electricity, no running water, and almost no one in the village had ever received any kind of formal education. But for Sumitra, her life had been exceptionally challenging, even compared to the struggles of her neighbor. When she was very young, her mother had passed away, leaving her devastated. Her father had to travel constantly to distant cities just to find temporary work so he could send money back to the village, which meant Sumitra was left alone for long periods. She was raised by a distant cousin who had many children of her own to care for, so Sumitra often felt neglected and lonely. Even after she grew up and got married, the loneliness did not go away. Her husband also had to travel frequently for his job, leaving Sumitra to live in a small mud hut with her husband's parents. She did not feel close to her in-laws, and her own relatives lived far away and could rarely visit. And so, Sumitra's adult life was very quiet and isolated. But when her baby boy was born, everything changed for her. For the first time in her life, she did not feel alone. She felt an overwhelming sense of joy and excitement for the future. She was happy that something in her life was finally going the way she wanted it to. But then, one day in early 1985, everything took a very strange and terrifying turn. On that particular morning, Sumitra was walking along the dusty dirt path toward the village well to fetch water, with her young son strapped to her chest. As she walked, she suddenly came to a complete stop. Her body went entirely rigid, and she dropped her heavy metal water bucket onto the ground. A couple of other villagers who were nearby heard the loud clatter of the bucket and turned to look at her. They saw Sumitra standing there, frozen like a statue. One of the villagers, feeling concerned, walked over to her and asked her if she was okay and what was going on. But Sumitra did not answer. She just stood there, completely unresponsive. The concerned villager looked down at Sumitra's hands and noticed that her fingers were bending backward at an angle so sharp it looked like they might actually break in the wrong direction. Then the villager looked up at Sumitra's face, and what they saw was deeply disturbing. Sumitra's eyes had rolled completely back into her head, leaving only the white parts visible, and she was grinding her teeth together with such incredible force that a loud, rhythmic cracking sound was coming from her jaw. The villager was terrified and took a step back. Right as they did, Sumitra's baby, sensing that something was wrong, began to cry hysterically. The sound of the crying baby, combined with the strange, grotesque pose that Sumitra was holding, quickly attracted the attention of other nearby villagers. Soon, a large crowd had gathered around Sumitra, everyone staring at her in shock, whispering and wondering what they should do. But then, just as suddenly as she had fallen into this bizarre state, it stopped. Sumitra shook her head, her eyes fluttered, and she looked around at the crowd in complete confusion. She became aware of her crying baby and the crowd of people staring at her, but she had absolutely no memory of what had just happened. Feeling deeply embarrassed, Sumitra quickly picked up her water bucket, comforted her son, and hurried away toward the well. When she returned home, Sumitra decided not to tell her husband or her in-laws about what had happened. She could barely remember the incident anyway, and she convinced herself that it must have been a fluke, perhaps brought on by the stress, exhaustion, and lack of sleep that came with caring for a new baby. She told herself that it would never happen again. But a few weeks later, it did. This time, the trance lasted much longer. Sumitra's father-in-law walked into the kitchen and found her standing completely rigid, with her hands bent backward and her eyes rolled back into her head. He would later tell her that he had shaken her and shouted her name, trying desperately to wake her up, but she remained frozen for nearly 10 minutes before finally snapping out of it. When she came to, she again had absolutely no memory of the event. By May of 1985, which was about 5 months after her first episode, Sumitra's condition had grown significantly worse. She was now falling into these bizarre frozen trances almost every single day, and they were lasting for hours at a time. Even more concerning to her family was that during these trances, Sumitra had started to speak. But the things she said made no sense. She would suddenly bark out desperate cries for help, screaming that her head was being crushed and that someone needed to save her. Then her voice would drop to a low, quiet whisper, and she would say that all she could see was darkness. Sumitra's family was terrified, and they contacted the local medicine man. He came to the hut and examined Sumitra thoroughly, but he was completely baffled. Outside of these strange trances, Sumitra was in perfect physical health. There were no signs of illness, injury, or disease. Then on July 16, 1985, Sumitra fell into another deep trance while she was cooking. But this time, her demeanor was different. She was very calm, and in a quiet, even voice, she said that in exactly 3 days she was going to die. By this point, Sumitra was completely exhausted and terrified of what was happening to her body, and her family was equally worn down. Sumitra had stopped taking care of her 8-month-old son because she was terrified that she would fall into a trance while holding him and accidentally drop or hurt him. Her mother-in-law had taken over the role of caring for the baby, and her husband had been forced to stop traveling for work, staying home full-time to help manage his wife's condition. On July 19, 1985, the day Sumitra had predicted she would die, she woke up and made a conscious effort to stay as safe as possible. She refused to cook because she did not want to be near the open fire. She stayed away from any ledges or steps to prevent herself from falling, and she kept a safe distance from her son to ensure his safety. By the late afternoon, nothing bad had happened, and Sumitra and her family began to relax, thinking that the prediction had just been the result of her troubled mind. As her mother-in-law began preparing dinner, Sumitra decided to step outside the hut to get some fresh air. While standing in the yard, she saw one of her close friends across the road and waved to her. As her friend cheerfully began walking over to say hello, Sumitra suddenly froze. Her eyes rolled back, her body went rigid, and she fell into another trance. The friend, who was used to seeing Sumitra's episodes, was not initially concerned. But then, Sumitra began doing something she had never done before. She raised her hands to her forehead and began wildly clawing at the air right above her head, as if she were trying to fight off an invisible attacker. Her breathing became incredibly loud, heavy, and labored. The friend, now deeply concerned, rushed over to her but did not know how to help. Suddenly, Sumitra stopped clawing, let her hands drop to her sides, and went completely still. A deep, low, rattling moan came from her throat, getting deeper and deeper until her voice cracked, and then she went totally silent. The friend realized that Sumitra was no longer breathing. She screamed for help, and Sumitra's family and the neighbors came running out. The medicine man arrived quickly, checked Sumitra's pulse and her heartbeat, and then looked up at the family and said that she was dead. Sumitra's body remained completely upright and rigid, frozen in a silent scream. Eventually, her father-in-law and the medicine man lowered her body onto the ground and closed her eyes. In this remote village, there were no hospitals or officials to call. According to Hindu tradition, it was very important to prepare and cremate the body as quickly as possible. The women of the village began washing Sumitra's body and applying essential oils to her face, while the men went to gather firewood for the cremation. There was a sense of deep grief, but also fear, in the village. Many believed that Sumitra had been possessed by a dark spirit that had now killed her. As the sun began to set, the women were brushing out Sumitra's hair when suddenly, one of them noticed something. Sumitra's eyelids were closed, but her eyes were moving rapidly underneath them. The women screamed and scrambled away from the body in terror. Suddenly, Sumitra's chest rose as she took a deep, sudden breath. She opened her eyes, sat bolt upright, and looked around the room. She appeared completely healthy and normal, even though she had had no heartbeat for 45 minutes. The medicine man ran back in, checked her pulse, and joyfully declared that a miracle had occurred and Sumitra was back from the dead. Her husband ran forward to embrace her, but as he did, Sumitra shrank back in terror, putting her hands up to block him. She looked at him with complete stranger's eyes. The medicine man stepped in, telling the husband that she had been through a traumatic experience and needed time to recover. The villagers went back to their homes and Sumitra was put to bed. But the next morning, when she woke up, the situation became even more bizarre. As soon as she saw her husband and in-laws, she bolted out of the hut and began running away. Her husband, father-in-law, and the medicine man chased her down. When her husband grabbed her arm to stop her, she ripped her arm away and angrily shouted, "How dare you touch another man's wife?" She screamed that they were not her family, that this was not her home, and that her real name was Shiva Dwivedi. She claimed that her in-laws had murdered her by hitting her over the head with a brick. Over the next few weeks, Sumitra's family tried everything to snap her out of this state, but nothing worked. She refused to touch her son, demanding that they bring her Ringu and Tinku. When no one knew who those people were, she would fly into a rage. Although Sumitra was completely illiterate, she now spent hours in her room writing long, perfectly composed letters in fluent Hindi to people she claimed were her real family, begging them to come rescue her. She spoke in a completely different, fast-paced urban accent. She rapped her sari in a sophisticated style that no one in the village used, and she refused to eat off any dishes that the family had used, claiming she was a wealthy woman who could not live in such poverty. The villagers eventually assumed she had suffered severe brain damage during the 45 minutes she was dead, and they simply focused on keeping her from running away. Then, on October 20th, 1985, 3 months after her death, an older gentleman wearing a nice suit and polished leather shoes knocked on the door of the hut. This man was Ram Trapathy, and he lived in a city 60 miles away. He had heard a bizarre rumor about a young woman in a remote village who was claiming to be his deceased daughter, Shiva Duety. At first, he did not believe it, but the rumors were so persistent that he decided to travel to the village to see for himself. When Sumitra saw him at the door, she ran out and threw her arms around him, crying and calling him Papa. Ram was skeptical, believing this was an elaborate hoax. He sat down on a low stone wall and opened a large, leather-bound photo album he had brought with him. He pointed to a photo containing dozens of people and asked Sumitra to identify them. To his absolute shock, she correctly named every single person in the photo, people that Sumitra's husband had never seen or heard of in his life. Ram turned the page and pointed to another photo, and again, she identified everyone correctly. Finally, Ram pointed to a photo of a single woman. Sumitra's face hardened with anger, and she said, "That is my sister-in-law, and she killed me by hitting me over the head with a brick." Hearing this, Ram dropped the book and embraced her, weeping. That was a detail about his daughter's death that had never been made public. Ram explained to Sumitra's husband that his daughter Shiva Duety was a wealthy, college-educated woman who had 2 young sons named Tinku and Ringu. She had lived with her in-laws, who treated her terribly because they resented her education and her family's wealth. On the night of May 18, 1985, neighbors had seen Shiva's in-laws carrying her unconscious body along the railroad tracks, claiming they were taking her to the hospital. The next morning, her body was found on the tracks. Her in-laws claimed she had committed suicide by jumping in front of a train, and they quickly cremated her body before her actual family could stop them. The police had accepted the suicide story, but Shiva's father was convinced she had been murdered. This case would go down as one of the most thoroughly investigated and credible cases of reincarnation or possession in scientific history. Researchers from the University of Virginia in America traveled to India to study Sumitra, interviewing dozens of witnesses, and they concluded that there was no logical way this could be a hoax. Sumitra had never left her remote village, had no education, and had no way of knowing any details about Shiva's life or family. Yet, she possessed all of Shiva's memories, her voice, her writing skills, and her personality. Although the police eventually opened an investigation into Shiva's death based on Sumitra's claims, the case could not be prosecuted because Sumitra's testimony was not legally admissible in court. Sumitra lived the rest of her life as Shiva, accepted by Shiva's real family, and she passed away in 1998. On February 15, 2004, 2 police officers in the quiet English village of Murrow drove down a peaceful residential street and pulled up in front of a small brick bungalow. Earlier that day, a concerned neighbor had called the police department to report a strange, persistent digging and metallic clanging sound that seemed to be coming from inside the bungalow. The neighbor explained that the sounds had been going on for some time, but had recently stopped. She was worried that something might be wrong with the owner. The 2 officers were not overly concerned as they walked up the path. Murrow was a very safe, low-crime village, and they assumed that a stray animal, like a badger or a fox, had managed to get inside the house or under the floorboards while the owner was away. They stood on the front porch and listened for a moment, but the house was completely silent. The officers knocked loudly on the front door, calling out to see if anyone was home. When they received no answer, one of the officers reached down and turned the door handle. To his surprise, the door was completely unlocked. He pushed the door open just a crack and called out again, identifying themselves as police officers. Still, there was only silence. But as the door swung open further, both officers immediately realized there was a major issue. The entire entryway and living room floor of the bungalow was flooded with several inches of standing water. From somewhere deep in the back of the house, they could hear the loud, steady sound of rushing water, like an open faucet or a broken pipe. The officers stepped into the flooded house, their boots sloshing through the cold water, and began walking down the narrow hallway toward the sound. As they reached the end of the hall, they saw an open door on their left leading into a bedroom. The sound of the rushing water was loudest here. They stepped into the room, turned to look, and what they saw completely shocked them, causing them to immediately spring into action. To understand what the officers were seeing, we have to look back to 2 months prior. The owner of the bungalow was 51-year-old Ronald McClagish. Ronald was a man who had faced a lot of difficulties in his life. He was divorced, struggled constantly with his finances, and suffered from several severe chronic health issues, including bad asthma and liver problems. Physically, he was very frail and weak. A few months earlier, he had started dating a woman, and she had become the one bright spot in his otherwise difficult life. But in December of 2003, she decided to end the relationship. The breakup devastated Ronald. He fell into a deep, paralyzing depression. For the next 6 weeks, he barely left his bed, letting his house fall into disrepair. His ex-girlfriend had left many of her personal belongings in the house, and seeing them every day only made his depression worse. Finally, on February 1st, 2004, Ronald decided he could not live like this anymore. He woke up feeling a rare sense of determination and decided to clear his home of everything that reminded him of his ex-girlfriend. He grabbed a large plastic trash bag and walked down the hallway to a spare bedroom that contained a small built-in closet. The closet was incredibly narrow, measuring only 2 feet wide and 2 feet deep. Ronald stepped inside the closet and began pulling her clothes off the hangers, stuffing them into the trash bag. As he was reaching for the last few items at the back of the closet, he heard a strange, heavy creaking sound behind him. Before he could turn around, the heavy wooden door of the closet slammed shut with immense force. Ronald was instantly plunged into pitch darkness. He reached out, grabbed the door handle, and tried to turn it, but it would not budge. He pushed against the door with his shoulder, but it was completely solid, as if something incredibly heavy was blocking it from the outside. What Ronald did not know was that a massive, heavy wooden wardrobe that stood next to the closet door had become unbalanced. When Ronald stepped into the closet and shifted his weight, the movement caused the wardrobe to topple forward, landing directly against the closet door, pinning it shut. Ronald began to scream for help at the top of his lungs, pounding his fists against the wooden door. But his bungalow was constructed of thick brick, and his neighbors' houses were set far back from his property. His screams did not carry outside. Because the closet was only 2 feet deep, Ronald was forced to remain standing. He could not sit down, bend his knees, or curl up on the floor. He had no food, no water, and no way to contact anyone. As the hours turned into days, Ronald grew weaker and weaker. In his desperation, he reached up and felt the ceiling of the closet, where he discovered a series of metal pipes. He realized that if he could break one of these pipes off, he could use it as a tool to pry open the door, dig through the plaster walls, or at least make a louder noise by banging it against the wood. He grabbed one of the pipes and pulled with all his remaining strength. The pipe snapped, but instead of giving him a tool for escape, it unleashed a nightmare. The pipe he had broken was the main water line for the house. Instantly, a high-pressure stream of freezing cold water began spraying directly onto Ronald's head and face. Because the space was so tight, he could not move out of the way. He was trapped directly under a freezing waterfall in total darkness. Despite the freezing water, Ronald did not give up. For days, he used the broken metal pipe to desperately claw at the plaster walls, trying to dig a hole into the adjacent room. He also beat the pipe against the door, hoping someone would hear. But the neighbor who heard the sounds did not realize what they were, assuming it was just a normal household noise. As the days passed, the constant exposure to the freezing water took a horrific toll on Ronald's body. His skin became so saturated with water that it began to soften, blister, and literally peel away from his face and body, leaving raw, open sores. Eventually, Ronald's frail body could no longer handle the extreme hypothermia and exhaustion. He dropped the pipe, slumped against the wall, and passed away. When the police officers entered the bedroom on February 15th, they saw the massive wardrobe lying flat against the closet door and the floor of the room covered in water. At the bottom of the closet door, they saw Ronald's feet protruding from the small gap at the bottom of the frame. The officers rushed over, and with great effort, they managed to heave the heavy wardrobe off the door. When they pulled the door open, they found Ronald's body, still standing rigid in the narrow space, with the freezing water still pouring down onto his head. On June 29, 2013, 35-year-old Larry Wells woke up at 3 a.m. in his home in Hamburg, New York, a quiet suburb just outside of Buffalo. Larry was careful to slip out of bed quietly so he would not wake his wife. She was 3 months pregnant with their second child, and caring for their 4-year-old daughter was already exhausting work, so Larry wanted to make sure she got as much sleep as possible. Larry got dressed in his work clothes, tiptoed out to his car, and drove through the dark, quiet streets. It was a Saturday morning, and at this hour, the town was completely still. Larry pulled his car into the parking lot of the local Toys R Us store where he had worked for the past 7 years. Larry had always wanted to be a teacher, and he had actually gone to college and earned a master's degree in education. But when he struggled to find a full-time teaching position, he took a job at Toys R Us to support his growing family. At first, he thought of it as a temporary job, but he quickly realized he loved working there. Larry had a fun, outgoing personality, and he loved interacting with the children who came into the store. He took great pride in his work, and his dedication paid off when he was promoted to store manager. Even though he was the manager, Larry frequently showed up at 4 a.m. on Saturdays to help his employees unload the weekly merchandise delivery trucks. On this morning, he walked up to the front doors and met two of his employees, Cindy Barron and Isaac Millette Lloyd, who were waiting outside. Larry unlocked the doors, let them in, and then locked the doors behind them as the store would not open to the public for several hours. The employees clocked in, grabbed their walkie-talkies, and went to work. Larry headed to the back of the store to open the loading dock doors and began helping the truck driver unload the boxes. By 4:30 in the morning, the truck was unloaded and the driver had left. Larry, Cindy, and Isaac were now working in different areas of the massive 41,000 square foot store. It was normal for them not to see each other for long periods, communicating only through their walkie-talkies. At 5 in the morning, another employee, Anthony Armstrong, arrived and called Larry's cell phone to be let in. Larry walked to the front, unlocked the door, let Anthony in, and locked it again. About 10 minutes later, another employee named Richard Shepard arrived. Richard had stopped at a local grocery store to grab a drink and was running slightly late. He called Larry's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. He sent a text but received no reply. Richard pressed his face against the glass to look inside, but saw no one. He decided to walk around the side of the building toward the Babies R Us entrance. To his surprise, he found one of the heavy sliding doors was standing wide open. This was a major violation of the store's strict security policies, but Richard was glad he did not have to wait in the cold, so he walked inside, clocked in, and began stocking shelves in his section. A little before 6 in the morning, Isaac finished stocking his aisle and went to the back stockroom to grab another pallet of toys. As he walked, he heard a strange, high-pitched, robotic wailing sound echoing through the store. He realized it was the store's security alarm. Isaac pulled out his walkie-talkie and said, "Hey Larry, the alarm is going off, can you turn it off?" But there was no response. Isaac changed the channel and asked if anyone could go find Larry. Cindy, who was working near the front of the store, radioed back that she would check the manager's office. A moment later, a horrific, blood-curdling scream echoed through the quiet store, followed by loud sobbing. Isaac and Anthony ran toward the front of the store and found Cindy shaking and crying hysterically. She gasped out that she needed to call 911 and ran to a nearby register. Isaac, Anthony, and Richard, who had just walked up, slowly entered the manager's office to see what had happened. Inside the office, they found their manager, Larry Wells, slumped over in his desk chair. He was bleeding profusely from a massive wound in his chest. Isaac called out his name, but Larry did not move. The only sound in the office was the loud screech of the telephone receiver, which had been left off the hook, dangling by its cord. The employees ran back out to the parking lot to wait for the police. As the dispatcher had warned them, there might still be an active shooter in the building. The Hamburg Police Department responded with every available unit, and the SWAT team quickly searched the building. Detective Sergeant Scott Cascino was called in to lead the investigation. When the building was declared safe, paramedics rushed inside and checked Larry. Miraculously, he still had a weak pulse. They loaded him onto a gurney and rushed him into an ambulance. As they sped toward the hospital, the paramedics realized Larry had not been shot. He had been stabbed twice, once in the shoulder and once directly in the heart. Despite their best effort, Larry passed away in the ambulance before they could reach the hospital. Detective Cascino began examining the crime scene inside the manager's office. He immediately noticed that the power cord to the store's security DVR system had been violently yanked out of the wall, disabling all the cameras. He also found a blue and orange Florida Gators baseball cap lying on the floor near the desk. Cascino suspected that the killer was someone who knew the store well, as they had managed to disable the security system. The police separated the 4 employees who were in the store that morning to interview them. Isaac was extremely nervous and trembling, which made him look suspicious. Anthony clammed up and refused to talk to the police. Cindy was cooperative and helped establish a timeline, noting that Anthony was the last person she saw near the office. Richard explained that he had entered through the open Babies R Us door, which was highly unusual. At noon, Bernie Grusha, the regional vice president of loss prevention for Toys R Us, arrived at the store to help the police with the investigation. Grusha was a respected corporate officer, and he went into the office with Detective Cascino to plug the DVR back in and retrieve the security footage. They rolled the tape back to 3:45 in the morning. On the screen, they watched the employees arrive and begin their shifts. At exactly 4:24 in the morning, a security camera pointed at the Babies R Us entrance captured a dark figure standing outside. The figure appeared to use a key or a tool to open the sliding door and slipped inside. The investigators watched as the intruder moved through the store, carefully hugging the walls and dodging behind displays to avoid being seen by the cameras. It was obvious that the intruder knew the exact locations of every camera and how to avoid them. The intruder was wearing dark sweatpants with lettering on the side, a scarf covering their face, and a Florida Gators baseball cap. In their hand, they were carrying a large, heavy knife. The figure entered the manager's office at 4:32, and the screen went black as the plug was pulled. Cascino realized the Florida Gators hat found on the floor belonged to the killer, and it was their best piece of evidence. The crime lab swabbed the hat and the DVR cord and successfully created a DNA profile of the killer. However, when they ran it through the national database, there was no match. The police then began the massive task of collecting DNA swabs from every current and former employee of the Hamburg store. Over the next few weeks, they collected 47 samples, but when the results came back, not a single one was a match. The police also investigated a lead about a black Chevy Impala that had been seen in the parking lot around the time of the murder, but they could not connect the car to any of the employees. They then identified a potential suspect named Patrick Walden, a local criminal who fit the FBI's psychological profile of the killer. Walden's girlfriend's mother worked at the Toys R Us, and when Walden was arrested on unrelated charges, police found a large knife in his car. An undercover officer followed Walden and collected a discarded cigarette butt to get his DNA. But weeks later, the lab confirmed that Walden's DNA did not match the crime scene evidence. Detective Cascino went back to the employee list and realized there was one person they had not tested. This employee had repeatedly avoided giving a DNA sample, making excuses about being out of town or too distraught to meet. The police tracked this employee to his father's house. As they pulled into the driveway, Cascino saw a Florida Gators bumper sticker on the back of a car parked there. They knocked on the door, and the employee agreed to give a quick cheek swab. In October, the DNA results came back, and the police finally had their match. The DNA on the Florida Gators hat and the DVR power cord belonged to Bernie Grusha, the regional loss prevention manager who had actually helped them review the security footage and investigate the crime scene. When police arrested Grusha and searched his home, they uncovered a massive criminal enterprise. Grusha, who was hired to protect the company's assets, had been running a highly organized theft ring, stealing over $200,000 worth of merchandise from various Toys R Us stores and reselling it on eBay to fund his lavish lifestyle and massive debts. His personal life was also in ruins. His wife had recently discovered he was cheating on her, and 3 weeks before the murder, he had staged a fake suicide by firing a gun in their bedroom just to see how she would react, resulting in his arrest and a restraining order. On the morning of the murder, Grusha had rented a black Chevy Impala and drove to the store, intending to steal cash from the manager's safe. He used his corporate key to open the side door and slipped inside. But as he was attempting to break into the safe, Larry Wells walked into the office. Larry recognized him and immediately reached for the phone to call for help. Grusha panicked, lunged at Larry, and stabbed him in the shoulder and heart before fleeing the scene, accidentally leaving his hat behind. Grusha pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Before sunrise on August 22, 1986, a man named Ephraim Che woke up inside his small mud brick house perched on a high cliff in the West African nation of Cameroon. Ephraim felt incredibly groggy, dizzy, and confused. He had a pounding headache, and his mind felt completely blank, as if he had been heavily drugged the night before. He tried to remember what had happened the previous evening, but his memories were highly fragmented. The only thing he could distinctly recall was hearing a massive, thunderous booming sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath his house. He had assumed it was just a severe thunderstorm and had gone to bed shortly after, feeling suddenly very ill and nauseous. Ephraim looked out his window, expecting to see wet ground and rain, but the sky was completely clear and the grass was bone dry. Ephraim swung his legs out of bed, but as soon as he stood up, his legs buckled and he nearly collapsed. He managed to steady himself and decided he needed to check on his 4 children. But his mind was so clouded that instead of going to their rooms, he wandered out his front door and stood in the yard, staring blankly into the distance. Ephraim lived in a highly remote village called Nios. The village was split into 2 sections: Upper Nios, which sat on a cliff near a large, deep volcanic lake called Lake Nios, and Lower Nios, which was located in a lush valley below. As Ephraim stood outside his house in Upper Nios, he suddenly realized that the world was completely and utterly silent. Usually, the mornings in Nios were filled with the loud sounds of baboons barking in the forest, birds chirping, and insects buzzing. But on this morning, there was absolutely no sound. Even the mosquitoes, which were a constant, annoying presence in the village, were completely gone. The silence was deafening and deeply unsettling. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a loud, frantic screaming coming from the direction of the lake. Ephraim turned and saw a local woman about 100 feet away. She was screaming in pure terror, ripping her clothes off and throwing them onto the ground. Ephraim ran toward her to see what was wrong. As he got closer, he noticed several strange shapes lying on the ground near the woman. When he reached her, he stopped in his tracks, his heart hammering in his chest. The shapes on the ground were the woman's entire family, along with all of their cattle. They were all lying perfectly still, as if they were fast asleep. But Ephraim noticed that there was dried blood around their noses and mouths, and none of them were breathing. They were all dead. The woman was kneeling on the ground, frantically pulling on her father's arm, begging him to wake up. Ephraim was overcome with a wave of intense, irrational fear. He turned and ran back to the main trail, fleeing down the hill toward Lower Nios. As he approached the valley, the silence continued. When he turned the corner onto the main street of Lower Nios, he expected to see people running around, but instead, the road was completely blocked by the bodies of dead animals. Cows, sheep, dogs, and chickens were piled everywhere. Ephraim, desperate to find someone who was alive, ran to the nearest mud hut and flung the door open. Inside, he found a woman lying dead on the floor. She had a wooden bowl of corn near her hand, as if she had been preparing a meal when she suddenly collapsed. In the adjacent bedroom, her entire family lay dead in their beds, their faces frozen. Ephraim stumbled back out into the street. As he looked around, he realized that many of the bodies on the road were not animals, but people. He saw people slumped in doorways, piled on top of each other, and one man still sitting on his motorcycle, slumped over the handlebars. Many of the bodies were completely naked, with their clothes torn off and lying in piles next to them. There were no signs of violence, no cuts, and no wounds on any of them. It was as if they had simply dropped dead in the middle of whatever they were doing. Ephraim continued walking down the road in a daze. Up ahead, he saw a father and his young son running toward him. Their eyes were wide and they had a terrified, vacant stare. They ran right past Ephraim as if he were invisible and disappeared into the forest. At that moment, a memory from Ephraim's childhood came flooding back. His grandfather had told him a legend about Lake Nyos. According to the story, a group of villagers had tried to cross the lake, and their leader had parted the waters so they could walk across the lake bed. But halfway across, a mosquito bit the leader, causing him to lose his focus, and the waters crashed down, drowning everyone. His grandfather said the angry ghosts of those drowned villagers lived in the large rocks near Lower Nyos and would one day return to destroy the village. Ephraim became convinced that the ghosts had returned, and he ran down the road in terror. He stopped at several more huts, finding nothing but corpses. Finally, as he approached another hut, the door swung open and a man named Joseph McQuain stepped out. Joseph was in terrible shape. His arms were covered in deep cuts from where he had collapsed the night before, and he was completely disoriented. Joseph told Ephraim that he had heard a loud booming sound the night before, followed by his daughter making a strange, heavy snoring noise. When he went to check on her, he immediately collapsed. He woke up that morning to find his daughter dead. The two men stood on the threshold, staring at each other in silence, too traumatized to speak. They shook hands and Joseph climbed onto his motorcycle and drove to the neighboring village to get help. The neighboring villagers did not believe his wild story at first, but when they traveled to Nyos the next day, they were horrified by what they found. On August 25th, an American scientist named Joseph Devine saw the news reports about the mysterious mass deaths in Cameroon. He immediately contacted the US government and was sent to Nyos along with his research partner, Harold Sigurdsson. When they arrived, the military was burying the dead in mass graves, and the survivors, including Ephraim and Joseph, were being treated for severe disorientation and breathing issues. Devine and Sigurdsson climbed the hill to Lake Nyos to take water samples. As they pulled the samples from the deep bottom of the lake, the caps of their testing tubes violently popped off. The scientists immediately knew what had happened. Lake Nyos is a volcanic crater lake, meaning it sits inside the bowl of an active volcano. Over hundreds of years, highly concentrated carbon dioxide gas had leaked from the earth and become trapped under immense pressure at the very bottom of the cold lake. On the night of August 21st, something, possibly a landslide or a small volcanic eruption, disturbed the lake water. This caused the trapped carbon dioxide to rapidly rise to the surface, bubbling up like a shaken bottle of soda. When the gas reached the surface, it formed a massive, invisible, and odorless cloud of pure carbon dioxide that rolled down the hills and into the valley at high speed. Because carbon dioxide is heavier than oxygen, it pushed all the fresh air out of the valley, creating a suffocating vacuum. The villagers and their animals were instantly deprived of oxygen. As they suffocated, the lack of oxygen caused their body temperatures to spike, which is why so many of them had frantically torn their clothes off before collapsing. The entire disaster had taken only a few minutes, killing over 1,700 people and thousands of animals. In April of 1979, a 69-year-old woman named Monica Myers was appointed as the mayor of a small, quiet village called Betterton, located in the U.S. state of Maryland. Betterton was a place with a rich and glamorous history. In the early part of the 20th century, it was a premier resort destination for wealthy families from major cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia. The town had been filled with grand hotels, fine restaurants, bustling shops, and beautiful wooden boardwalks along the water. But by the time Monica became mayor, Betterton had fallen into a state of severe decline. The tourists had stopped coming, the grand hotels had either been abandoned or destroyed by fires, and the summer homes had been sold off. The wooden boardwalks had rotted and crumbled into the bay, and the beach was now lined with shanties where homeless people lived. Monica had grown up in Betterton during its golden age, and she loved the town deeply. She was determined to do everything she could to revitalize the community. Monica was not a typical mayor who managed the town from behind a desk. She was incredibly hands-on and spent her days walking the streets, helping residents, and doing physical labor for free. She would ride along with the local police, pick up trash on the beach, make repairs to public buildings, and knock on doors to check on the elderly. The residents of Betterton loved her and were used to seeing her out and about every single day, And so, on March 20th, 1980, when Monica did not show up for her usual morning rounds, the people of Betterton immediately noticed her absence. By mid-morning, a large portion of the town's residents were out searching for her. At 11:30 that morning, the local police received a frantic call from a worker at the town's sewage treatment plant. The worker was hysterical and told the officers they needed to get to the plant immediately. The sewage treatment plant was located in a remote, heavily wooded area outside of the town center, and people rarely went there. When the police arrived, they found the worker standing outside the front door of a large, plain metal warehouse, crying and gesturing for them to follow him inside. The worker was too distraught to explain what had happened, so the officers followed him into the building. They entered a massive room filled with large, 15-foot-tall industrial vats. As they walked further into the room, they were hit by a horrific, toxic stench that made them gag and cough. They had to stop for a moment to cover their faces and catch their breath. The worker pointed toward the top of one of the massive vats. The officers climbed up a metal catwalk that stretched across the ceiling of the warehouse directly over the open vats. When they looked down into the vat below, they saw Monica Myers. She was lying face down, partially submerged in the thick, dark material inside the vat, and she was deceased. An investigation revealed that Monica had gone to the sewage treatment plant alone that morning to help clean and test the vats, a task she had done many times before without supervision. While she was standing on the metal catwalk, she had lost her footing and fallen 15 feet into the open vat of human waste. Because of the thick, clay-like consistency of the waste, it acted like quicksand. When Monica hit the surface, she was not able to swim or pull herself out. As she struggled, the heavy material dragged her down, preventing her from reaching the sides of the vat. The autopsy confirmed that she had died of drowning after inhaling the toxic waste. Her tragic death devastated the small community she had worked so hard to protect. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.